You're standing in Jerusalem, July 15th, 1099. The walls have fallen, the screaming has stopped. But for the wives of the defeated Muslim warriors, the real nightmare is just beginning. What the Crusaders did to these women in the aftermath of conquest makes battlefield death look like a merciful release. The chronicles tell us about the glorious victories, the reclaimed Holy Lands, the triumph of Christian arms. What they don't tell you is what happened when the dust settled and the conquering armies turned their attention to the living spoils of war. Because for every warrior who died defending his city, there was a wife, a daughter, a sister left breathing. And breathing was the cruelest fate of all. Medieval warfare operated under rules that modern minds can barely comprehend. When a city fell, everything inside became property of the victors. That included human beings. Specifically, it included women. The legal frameworks of both Christian and Islamic societies created a systematic approach to dealing with captured females that was so efficient, so comprehensive, and so devastating that it functioned like a well-oiled machine of human destruction. The aftermath of Jerusalem's fall reveals the scope of this system. When the Crusaders breached the walls, they didn't just kill indiscriminately, they captured strategically. Contemporary sources document that thousands of women and children were taken alive specifically for the slave trade. These weren't battlefield casualties. These were calculated acquisitions of valuable human resources. Archaeological evidence from Crusader-era slave markets tells us exactly how this system functioned. Dublin's Woodquay excavations revealed the infrastructure of medieval human trafficking. Iron shackles sized for women's wrists, children's ankle restraints, warehouse foundations designed to hold human inventory for extended periods. The physical evidence proves that slave trading wasn't an occasional byproduct of warfare. It was a primary objective. The going rates appear in surviving commercial records. 20 silver pieces for a young woman, 15 for a mother, 10 if she showed signs of resistance during capture. These prices were carved into stone receipts found in trading centres across Europe and the Middle East. Human beings reduced to inventory items with standardised pricing structures. But here's where the true horror emerges. Being sold was the fortunate outcome. The women who ended up in slave markets were the lucky ones. For those deemed unsuitable for sale or those whose resistance marked them as problematic, alternative fates awaited that make slavery look like salvation. The Damascus Chronicle records what happened to prisoners who couldn't be monetized. Friday prayers at Baghdad's Sultan's Mosque were disrupted by crowds weeping for the fate of women captured by Frankish forces. The chronicler describes systematic enslavement, but stops short of detailing the processes that preceded sale. Contemporary accounts fill in those gaps with descriptions that reveal the methodical destruction of human dignity that prepared women for their new lives as property. Imad ad-Din's account of Saladin's conquest provides the most detailed description we have of what conquest meant for captured Christian women. His words are clinical in their precision. Thousands of women were deflowered, stripped of modesty, forced into servitude that combined domestic labour with sexual availability. The language suggests systematic processing rather than random violence. These women underwent transformation procedures designed to break their resistance and reshape their identities according to their captors' requirements. The conversion process was equally devastating. Captured Christian women were forced to abandon their religion, their names, their entire sense of self. They received new Islamic names that reflected their physical characteristics or their intended functions. Young women of exceptional beauty were reserved for the Sultan's court, often presented as gifts between military commanders. The psychological destruction was as complete as the physical subjugation. The harem system created a hierarchy of exploitation that gave captured women just enough hope to maintain compliance while ensuring their complete dependence on their captors. Some women could rise in status through bearing children to their owners. Others remained domestic servants until death. But all existed in a state of permanent legal non-existence, owning nothing, controlling nothing, with no recourse under law. The scale of this system becomes clear when you examine the numbers. After Jerusalem's fall, an estimated 15,000 prisoners were taken. Contemporary sources break this down precisely: 7,000 men, 8,000 women and children. The men faced execution, galley slavery, or hard labor until death. The women faced something worse. They faced systematic erasure of everything they had been, followed by decades of exploitation in roles specifically designed to maximize their suffering while maintaining their utility. The Christian response to captured Muslim women followed identical patterns. The massacre at Jerusalem in 1099 demonstrates that Crusader forces applied the same systematic approaches to human processing. When they breached the city walls, the killing was selective. Warriors died quickly. Women were preserved for purposes that extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of battle. Rabbinic sources describe how Jewish women faced identical treatment. When the Crusaders gathered Jerusalem's Jewish population in synagogues, they didn't burn all the buildings immediately. Selection processes occurred first. Young women were removed before the fires were set. Contemporary accounts mention these removals but don't detail what happened to the selected individuals. Archaeological evidence from Crusader settlements tells that story. The legal frameworks that enabled this systematic exploitation were sophisticated and comprehensive. Both Islamic and Christian law codes contained detailed provisions for dealing with captured women. These weren't emergency measures developed during wartime. These were established legal principles that had been refined through centuries of practice. The law itself became a weapon of systematic oppression that made resistance futile and escape impossible. What makes this particularly devastating is how the system created hope as a form of torture. Women who complied completely might see their children spared. Those who bore sons to their captors might gain marginal improvements in status. The possibility of eventual freedom dangled just out of reach, ensuring cooperation while making liberation effectively impossible. The economic incentives driving this system explain its persistence and sophistication. Captured women generated revenue streams that lasted decades. Initial sale prices were just the beginning. Rental agreements, breeding contracts and resale markets created ongoing income from human inventory that could appreciate in value over time. The breeding programs were the most calculated aspect of this system. Captured women weren't just exploited individually, they became part of systematic reproduction schemes designed to produce the next generation of slaves. Islamic law permitted sexual relations between masters and female slaves, making forced pregnancy not just legal, but economically incentivized. Christian women captured during the Crusades found themselves in breeding facilities that operated with the efficiency of livestock operations. The transformation centers that prepared women for their new roles reveal the industrial scale of this exploitation. Upon arrival at processing facilities, women underwent systematic identity destruction. Their hair was cut or styled according to regional preferences. Their clothing was replaced with garments that marked their slave status. Most devastatingly, they were assigned new names that erased their previous identities completely. A Christian woman named Margaret became Zara. A Muslim woman named Fatima became Mary. The psychological impact of losing even their names cannot be overstated. Training procedures followed established protocols designed to break resistance while maintaining the woman's market value. Contemporary manuals describe specific techniques for subduing newly captured women without causing damage that would reduce their selling price. The methods were precise, tested through generations of practice, and horrifically effective. Women learned quickly that compliance offered the only path to survival, even if that survival came at the cost of everything they had once been. The transportation networks that moved captured women across medieval trade routes were equally systematic. Slave caravans operated on regular schedules, following established routes that connected capture points to major markets. The logistics were sophisticated. Rest stops provided food and water calculated to maintain the cargo's condition. Medical attention ensured that valuable inventory arrived in sellable condition. Guards were trained in crowd control techniques specific to managing groups of captive women. Maritime slave routes reveal the international scope of this trade. Ships designed specifically for human cargo transported thousands of captured women between Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Naval archaeological evidence shows vessel modifications that provided ventilation systems for human holds, water storage for extended voyages, and restraint systems that prevented suicide attempts during transport. These weren't improvised solutions. They represented generations of refinement in human trafficking technology. The market mechanisms that determined women's fates operated with brutal efficiency. Age determined primary classification. Women under 20 commanded premium prices for breeding purposes. Those between 20 and 30 were valued for domestic service combined with sexual availability. Women over 30 faced immediate execution unless they possessed specific skills that added value. The calculations were purely economic, reducing human beings to commodity assessments based on utility projections. Physical evaluation procedures followed standardized criteria that appeared in merchant handbooks across the medieval world. Tooth condition indicated overall health. Scarring revealed resistance history. Breast development suggested breeding potential. These examinations were conducted publicly, stripping away the last vestiges of dignity before sale. The women stood naked on auction blocks while buyers examined their purchases like livestock at market. The legal documentation surrounding slave transactions proves this wasn't informal brutality. It was regulated commerce with contracts, warranties, and dispute resolution mechanisms. Bills of sale specified the woman's age, origin, physical condition, and any guarantees about her behavior or capabilities. Buyers could return defective merchandise. Sellers provided authenticity certificates. The paperwork treated human beings as commercial inventory, subject to standard business practices. Religious justifications for this system appear in contemporary theological writings from both Christian and Islamic sources. Scholars developed elaborate theological frameworks that classified captured women as legitimate spoils of war, blessed by divine approval. These weren't fringe interpretations, they were mainstream religious doctrine that provided moral cover for systematic exploitation. The churches and mosques didn't just tolerate this trade, they actively participated in it. The psychological warfare embedded in these systems was as devastating as the physical exploitation. Women were forced to watch their children sold to different buyers, ensuring they could never attempt escape without abandoning their offspring. Mothers were separated from daughters, creating additional leverage for controlling behavior. The emotional bonds that might have provided strength became weapons used against them. Some women found ways to resist that the chronicles deliberately ignored. Contemporary records hint at coordinated suicide pacts among captured women who preferred death to slavery. Others mention mysterious deaths in slave compounds that officials attributed to disease but which showed patterns suggesting deliberate self-harm. The silence surrounding these acts of resistance reveals how thoroughly the system sought to erase even the memory of defiance. The most chilling evidence comes from the children born into this system. Mixed heritage offspring faced predetermined fates based on their parentage. Sons might eventually gain freedom through military service. Daughters inherited their mother's slave status automatically. But the mortality rates among these children tell the real story. Archaeological evidence from slave compounds shows infant death rates approaching 90%. These weren't natural deaths from disease or malnutrition. The bone trauma patterns indicate deliberate killing of unwanted children whose mixed bloodlines created complications for the slave system. The economic. Tax records that survive reveal the true scale of this industry. Documents from major medieval cities show slave trade revenues comprising significant portions of municipal income. Import duties on human cargo, licensing fees for slave dealers, and transaction taxes on sales created revenue streams that entire regional economies depended upon. The systematic exploitation of captured women wasn't just morally acceptable in medieval society, it was economically essential. So the next time you see a painting of noble Crusader knights or read about the glorious conquests of medieval warfare, remember what those chronicles deliberately omitted. Behind every victory, beyond every fallen city wall, lay a systematic machinery of human destruction that treated women as inventory to be processed, priced, and distributed. The archaeological evidence doesn't lie. The price lists carved in stone don't lie. The shackles sized for women's wrists don't lie. These weren't isolated acts of wartime brutality. This was industrial-scale exploitation that operated with the efficiency of a business enterprise and the blessing of religious authority. For the wives of defeated warriors, death in battle would have been mercy. Instead, they faced decades of systematic erasure, their identities stripped away, their children murdered or sold, their bodies transformed into profit-generating assets for their captors. The medieval world created legal, economic, and religious frameworks specifically designed to justify this horror, and it worked so effectively that the evidence was nearly erased from historical memory. But the bones remember. The foundations of those processing centres remember. The iron chains remember. The iron. This is the history they didn't want you to know. The real cost of medieval conquest wasn't measured in fallen warriors. It was measured in the systematic destruction of thousands of women whose only crime was surviving the battlefield. Their suffering built empires, funded churches, and created the wealth that powered medieval civilization. And for over 1,000 years, their voices have been buried beneath the glory of conquest. Until now.